So you start the day by brushing your wooden teeth. You are a wooden puppet. A Fisherman's Tale. So I want to start this one off by saying that I am not a huge fan of puzzle games, and I do enjoy a good story, so I'm not opposed to story games. However, I've seen this many times in the Viveport library, and I believe the description starts as a puzzle-driven story game, at which point I just checked out. It recently won 2019 Game of the Year from the VR Awards, which I thought, well, this definitely needs looked at then. So I'm gonna have some mildly hot takes on whether or not I agree with that. But before that, I'm gonna say that I am gonna play some of the game, which is I think be obvious. But it is story driven, and there are only this show's 6. Really, though, the epilogue and the prologue and epilogue are very short and very little to do in them. So there's only 4 real chapters of gameplay. I'll play through the first one, skipping the epilogue, so that way, if you still want to play spoiler free or not know everything about the story, you can watch safely. If you have concerns with having something spoiled, you can go to the timestamp here, and that will be at the end of the time I spend in the game, and where I'll give a few other thoughts on what I've seen here, again, without spoilers. So, again, it is puzzle-based. I don't want to say I don't like the game, because I certainly enjoyed the very short time I had with it. I finished it, though, in about 45 minutes, my first time through. And part of why it took so long was getting used to the controls. So I don't think it's a bad game, because the story was okay. It wasn't great, I don't think, but it was good. It conveyed what it wanted to, and the actual gameplay itself is different. It's innovative. It's new. But if I were to sit down and say this is the or even one of the best games to come out in 2019, I just don't think I could. So we'll go over that.
Every morning, the fisherman's puppet awoke inside his model lighthouse with everything in its place. And he began his day the same way. Except this morning, something felt different.
So you start the day by brushing your wooden teeth. You are a wooden puppet. You interact with it.
The window had been boarded up. The fisherman didn't remember doing that. Even when the storm came, he was safe in here.
So,
but no 2 thick planks of wood were going to get between him and his routine.
So you interact with things in the environment. 95% of things do nothing or are just there for looks, which is still kind of neat. But that's where the puzzle aspect comes in. So in this case, we start the day, as you learn in the prologue, by brushing our teeth. We go over and start the fire. Now, controls, I mentioned...
He needed some air. He had to find a way to pry off the boards.
Yep. Is not great. I say that because I'm using Oculus Touch controllers. Left, right, up, down on either one does nothing. The only way you can get to move around is actually pushing in on the stick. You can teleport by pressing down, or if you hold to the right and left and then press down, you can snap turn. There's no other options. There's no smooth movement, no smooth turning, nothing like that.
He needed to find something to pry off the boards.
Now, I will say it's a fairly small environment for the most part, so you could maybe get away with room scale if you had a really big environment, but I don't. I'm looking at like maybe a 5x5 area, so the controls were not great. You may have noticed my hands can fly out. That's what your grip buttons do, and so that's if something's just out of reach, you can still get it. But if you do grab something with your trigger, you still have to hold on to it as you're doing that. So in this case, we need to get those nails off those nails or those pieces out of those pieces of wood so we can get the window open. So normally you'd come over here and start a fire. We don't want to start a fire if we can't open the window. So again, the controls are not
This
great.
would do. What was it Papa used to say? Use the right tool for the right job.
Yep. So we're gonna pluck all these out, and this feels kind of cool,
Nearly
you know.
there. What was this feeling? The fisherman hadn't felt like this for a long time.
The story probably won't make sense at the moment, or for the rest of
At
this,
last,
and that's fine.
the smell of the ocean.
Oh yeah, it's actually open.
But outside, not the sea. He couldn't believe his wooden eyes. Outside the room was another room, a replica room. And standing in it, a huge but very familiar figure of a fisherman. And he knew that if that huge figure were to turn, its face would be very familiar. Sacre bleu! If this was what lay outside, then what was inside his own little model lighthouse, in the model of his own room?
So this is what they're talking about here, and this is the interesting thing about the game that's I have not seen in anything else. So you're a puppet of a
The
puppet of a
fisherman
puppet.
hardly dared to take the roof off to look inside his own little model.
So
Yet, he had to.
you're a puppet who makes models with a puppet who makes models with a puppet who makes. You get the idea. So in this case, we want to take off.
It was all there inside the model, exact in every detail. But the tiny version of himself, it was moving. He was inside the model, he was outside the model, and just who was pulling all the strings?
Dear listeners, a general alert to all lighthouses. In spite of all of our thrilling up-to-the-minute warnings, a lone boat has gone out into the storm. Lighthouse keepers, make sure your lights are shining bright. I repeat, a lone boat has gone out into the storm.
The lighthouse. The world might be folding in on itself, but only one thing mattered now. He had to turn on the lighthouse lamp high above. The life of a fellow sailor was at stake. A huge anchor blocked the only door. Whoever did it must really want to keep the storm out, or keep something in.
So there's the anchor, and the way you get through the game is you interact with your puzzle self, or even you, for example, if you needed, I don't know why you would, but let's just say you need a giant vase. You can then pluck your normal size
It was
vase
time to raise this anchor.
into the model, and a giant one pops in. Likewise, if you need a smaller vase, you can drop it out the window. And now we have a smaller vase. So that's how you get through the puzzles in the game. I'll go through ahead and do this next part, and then I'll stop because that's pretty much the whole game. Is you're figuring out what to do next, and you're interacting between your big self and your little self, and kind of swapping things back and forth and all that. So in this case, in order to move that big anchor, we have to reach in to our model and pull out
Of course.
the model
As
anchor.
below, so above. When he lifted the tiny anchor, the large one was lifted by his giant self.
So this is really cool, and this is by far the best part of the game, and I think the newness and innovation of it is why it's on the best of list that it's on. However, to me, it isn't a strong enough thing.
Now, time to get out of this little room.
So I'll just go ahead and kind of chill out and play with stuff as I talk. But yeah, it is definitely cool. It is neat, and they use it in some interesting ways later. They use it in some confusing ways later, and then I would say even in the last act, some ways that doesn't really make sense based on how you've done it in the prior acts. But the story unfolds. You then get into the lighthouse and go up, and then you find out more details about that radio broadcast and stuff like that. Because again, the
Path
main,
was clear. Time to light the lighthouse.
other than this thing here, where you're interacting with your smaller self, there's the game relies heavily on the story, and it was a decent story, but it didn't really get me the way that I think it was supposed to. And I'm not some hard tough guy. I've like teared up in certain games before, but this just didn't do it for me. So we'll go ahead and see if we can't get back to the main menu. There we go. So, yep, that's fine. So yeah, this is basically a Fisherman's Tale. Again, it's not a bad game. I enjoyed the short time that I spent with it, and I think that's probably my biggest issue. I'm not a huge like I have to get $1 per hour out of a game for it to be good, but my first time through took me less than an hour. The puzzles weren't challenging, and I would say this is considered a game because of the puzzles, but I would actually argue that it's more of an interactive experience, only because the puzzles have no fail state. If you lose an item, if you throw it out of the window when you needed it, or it just falls out of the world, which sometimes happens, sometimes too often, maybe, it just respawns. So there is no fail state. You can't lose. You basically just will, just keep pounding your fist or your head against the wall and brute forcing by pushing objects onto other objects until you figure it out. So in my mind, this is not a game. It's an interactive experience, and it's great as that. But for me to put a stamp or even acknowledge a stamp of this is the best VR game or experience to come out all year, I just can't agree with that. So, A Fisherman's Tale. Definitely check it out if you're into story, very light puzzles. But if your idea, I guess my concern is that someone sees that list and says, "Well, hey, I just got into VR and this is clearly the cream of the crop and what it's all about." It's not. It's definitely something that VR is about, but it is not the pinnacle of VR for 2019, in my mind.